My name is Jeff Sutton. I'm a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. This panel is Federalism and the Economic Crisis. Federalism does not seem to do well in economic crises. It seems to do even less well when the crisis straddles two administrations of different political parties, both with strong nationalist agendas. And it seems to do even less well when many of the states are bordering, at least teetering on bankruptcy. There are three basic sources of congressional power in relation to the states. The first is the Commerce Clause, but most economic regulation does affect commerce, so that's not much of a limitation in this area. The second is Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Most responses to the economic crises, however, don't involve civil rights. That leaves the third power, the Spending Clause power. The problem with the Spending Clause power is whether it has or imposes any meaningful limits on Congress. I think that will occupy much of the discussion today with our four panelists. And I think their discussion is going to extend not just to economic responses to the economic crisis, but even to legislation like No Child Left Behind, which responds to a different crisis. We have four terrific panelists. Each is going to speak for 8 to 10 minutes or so. I'm going to work hard at monitoring that. When they're done, I may ask a question or two to prompt a little rebuttal, and then we'll open up the questioning to the rest of you. We've got terrific ideological diversity on this panel. I wouldn't say their stations in life are that diverse. They all come from the academy. The best we could do for diversity on that front was 3 professors, and our diversity candidate is a dean. We'll start with the dean, which is, I understand it, how most faculty meetings start. That would be John Eastman, the dean at Chapman University School of Law. He is the director of the Claremont Institute for Constitutional Jurisprudence, a public interest law firm dedicated to restoring the constitutional principles adopted by our nation's founders. He has a JD from the University of Chicago and a PhD from Claremont. He clerked for Judge Ludig and Justice Thomas. He's written extensively on federalism, including an article called Revival of Federalism and one called Federal Legislation and States' Rights of Hapless Toads, Homegrown Medical Marijuana, and Wiccan Worship in State Prisons. Since you've only got 10 minutes, you're going to have to address just one of those. Dean Chapman.
Thank you, Judge Sutton. One slight correction. When I became dean, I could no longer handle being the director of our Constitutional Jurisprudence Clinic, and so Tom Casso, formerly of Pacific Legal Foundation, is the new director of that clinic and got us back in the business. I think we have 7 briefs in the Supreme Court this term alone. Judge Sutton talked about the most economic regulation affects commerce, and so there's really no limits there. And a similar view pervades on the Spending Clause. Well, I think both of those views are wrong. It's because economic regulation has an effect on commerce doesn't mean it's a regulation of commerce among the states. And I think back in 1973, when a project was launched to try and restore the notion of limits on the Commerce Clause, it finally came to fruition in United States versus Lopez. It didn't ultimately succeed because we didn't run a parallel track on the Spending Clause, which in my view has similar limits, at least as originally understood by the founders. Now I want to be real clear here. I'm not giving a descriptive view of what the law is. So those of you who are here for CLE to get the latest on what the law is, you're not going to get it from me. Nor am I giving a predictive view of what the court is likely to do, because I've usually been pretty wrong about those things. I'm rather going to give a normative talk on what it ought to do if they were to take seriously what the founders thought that they had done. And I want to start by talking about why this is so important and why the current spending, whether it's Stimulus 1 or 2 or TARP 1 or just the regular appropriations bill or the No Child Left Behind. By the way, I commend to your attention the recent No Child Left Behind Act in Pontiac. I forget the full name of the case. Judge Sutton is one of the judges that authored one of the opinions in the case. You got to have a score sheet to try and figure out all the lineup of where all the judges are on it. But Judge Sutton's point dealt with the coercion and the relatedness prongs. But nowhere in the opinion do we begin with the prior question, does this spending program meet the requirement that it be in the general welfare? And I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about how the founders viewed that question against a backdrop of some political theory that I think they had in mind. So writing about the time that we're drafting the Constitution, a Scottish history professor at the University of Edinburgh named Alexander Tyler has this to say in a book he's writing looking at the fall of the Athenian Republic. He says, "A democracy is always temporary in nature and simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefit from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse over loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship." He then goes on to say that the average age of the world's greatest civilizations have been about 200 years. And during those 200 years, every one of them kind of progresses through a similar sequence. From bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to complacency, from complacency to apathy, apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. I don't know where exactly we are on that scale, but I think it's no longer great courage, or in many cases liberty, abundance in some cases, complacency in many, apathy, and increasing numbers, dependence. This is not a trend that bodes well. Now, our founders, I think, understood that dynamic in democracies. And they put in a number of checks in our constitutional system to try and forestall that, what looked to be a fairly inevitable consequence of democratic rule. And one of the checks they had is that most of the spending, the day-to-day spending of government, was to occur at a local level, where the benefits and costs of the programs were to be lined up. So if you want to build a road, you tax yourselves to build the road. And if the road costs a lot more than its value, you don't vote for the bond in order to build that road. I remember last year in our little local election in Long Beach, California, where I live, we had a bond that was going to widen one of the roads and put in a couple of trees along. It was going to be very nice, but it was rather expensive to do that, and it wasn't a good economic time to raise our own taxes to do that. And the bond lost. Instead of our city officials getting the message that we didn't think it was worth the cost, the first answer out of their mouths the next morning, faced with this defeat, was, well, we'll now line up at the Treasury to try and get some of the stimulus money. As if somehow the good folks in Arkansas or Connecticut thought that maybe something we didn't think was worthwhile that we were going to benefit from was worthwhile for them to pay for. And this doesn't make any sense. And the founders understood that. And